Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated economist here. So I was just reading an article coming out of Bloomberg suggesting that the Federal Reserve is going to be lowering interest rates in the beginning of the year or going out throughout the next year. Now, I find this to be very wishful thinking, considering that the Federal Reserve is going to keep interest rates elevated for a significant amount of time to make up for the fact that they failed to achieve the 2% inflation target for the last 10 previous years. So now, when we think about the Federal Reserve and keeping interest rates elevated for a significant amount of time, we really have to think about what kind of impact they are having to the economy that would actually get them to lower rates. The Federal Reserve is mandated to do two things: low and stable prices of around 2% inflation, whatever that's supposed to mean, and full employment. Now, full employment is a really tricky one to think about because to me, like full employment means that anybody who is wanting to work would have a job. But that's not really the way the Federal Reserve is looking at full employment. The way the Federal Reserve is really looking at full employment is how low is unemployment. Right? Not so much like how much are people working, how strong is the workforce, how many people out there are actually working with a wage that is going to provide them with a standard of living that is adequate. None of that stuff. Right? They don't look at any of that. They're looking at how or where the unemployment rate is going. Right? And if the unemployment rate is low and remains low and is significantly low for a significant amount of time, the Federal Reserve is not interested in adjusting interest rates. The only way that they are going to adjust interest rates on account of the unemployment is if it rises, so that they can try and lower unemployment by getting people out there to actually borrow money to start businesses or conduct business. And by doing that, you can actually get people to go out there and hire employees. Right? Or if the prices come down to a significant level that is achieving their 2% inflation target. Right? Those are the two things. Nothing else matters. Like all these people who talk about markets or talk about the housing market or talk about all this other stuff are really missing the point coming from the Federal Reserve. They're not mandated to do those things. They are not mandated to make sure that your housing market stays elevated or the stock market stays elevated. They are not mandated to make sure that the government can afford their debt payments. They're not mandated to do any of that stuff. So when I hear people talk about their Fed strategy and how, the government can't afford the debt payments, or, if the stock market crashes, everybody's going to lose their retirement, the Fed won't allow it to happen, or something like that nature. I don't know what excuses they're making up, but it's silly. It doesn't, they're not looking at it like that. You think about it. I hear people saying that the housing market is going to crash, right? This is a big one that I hear a lot about. The interest rates are elevated and the housing market is going to crash and the Fed is going to have to reverse course. And I'm thinking to myself, there is nothing that I see out there that suggests to me that there's a housing market crash outside of the lack of sales taking place. Now, I know a lot of people would look at the lack of sales taking place because the interest rates are elevated, less people are borrowing money to buy a house. I totally get it, right? That makes a lot of sense when you hear about it, right? And if there's less sales of homes taking place, that essentially is the crash, right? More sales, hotter, more activity, that's a good economy, right? Less sales activity taking place, that's a slow economy, that's not good, right? That makes sense. But then when we think about the crash, a lot of times people are referring to the prices, and that's not the same thing. Right? Yeah, there's a crash in home sales, but there's not a crash in home prices. There's a huge difference inside of this. And now when people think about a housing market crash, they're thinking about prices coming down. And they're thinking, man, when prices come down, everybody's going to have a shot at going out and buying a house. It doesn't work like that. Right? What's happening is that there's a lack of inventory. And the ability to go out there and buy a house happens when a lot of people are rolling their houses over, right? Getting out of this house, moving into that house. Lots of houses on the housing market, giving people the opportunity to get in and out. But all of a sudden, nobody's selling. Everybody's locked in on their low interest rates. Everybody's worried about whether or not they're going to be able to acquire another house and be able to afford those payments because the interest rates are higher, all of a sudden sales fall. Boom. There's no more sales out there. Very few of them. And so people assume this is the crash that's taken place and only a matter of time before we start seeing prices come down, but they're not really looking at what is really going to cause the prices to come down. That would be foreclosures, right? If you have all of a sudden a wave of foreclosures coming onto the market, then you would have people's inventory levels start to rise as far as the different housing markets out there. And if this inventory level starts to rise, then the opportunity to start buying a house at a lesser price starts to show itself. But if there's no homes out there for sale and one comes up for sale, man, there's a lot of people out there looking to buy homes. And if it's even remotely close to a good deal, it gets nabbed up right away. Boom. Right. See, the rising of interest rates didn't crash the housing market. What it did is it slowed the amount of sales that were taking place out there, which people assumed is going to be a crashing housing market. It's not the same thing. Right? Now, what we're going to end up finding here as we go into the future is people are anticipating that interest rates are going to be falling into the future. And if any kind of decent deal comes up on a house, they're going to buy it thinking that they're going to be able to refinance that house going into the future. Especially if you find news articles like the one that I am posting down in the link of this video coming out of Bloomberg suggesting that very thing. I mean, you think about it. If you put this narrative out there in a lot of news outlets, the Fed's going to be reversing course next year. Interest rates are coming down next year. Is it going to be 50 basis points? Is it going to be 125 basis points? How much is it going to be coming down next year? Down, next year. People are thinking, oh man, I better get my opportunity to get a house so I can refinance next year. You see what's happened here? See, there's no reversing course coming from the Federal Reserve. The Fed is not going to move their Fed funds level down until unemployment rises and prices come down. Neither one of those things have we seen even suggest that it's happening. There's nothing that suggests that to me that it's going to happen next year. So I don't understand how it is that people could take on this idea that the Fed is going to be reversing course next year. There's nothing out there that even remotely come close to suggesting that, except for people's opinions coming out of places like Bloomberg, where they suggest this is going to happen, but yet have no real idea on why it is that the Federal Reserve would do that. You see, the Fed is trying to move the neutral interest rate. The neutral interest rate is the rate that is neither accommodating nor restricting the economy. And that neutral interest rate was too low for too long. Now, if they can put the inflation expectation out there and push the interest rates much higher, if they can get the inflation expectation to actually create the inflation, right, then they can keep those interest rates elevated for a significant amount of time, and that in itself will begin to raise the neutral interest rate. And the farther up the neutral interest rate goes, the more ammo the Federal Reserve is getting back. So all this talk about lowering interest rate, that means that the Federal Reserve will be giving up their strategy to acquire their ammo back in order to fight the next recession. They would be giving up early. I don't see that happening. The Federal Reserve has no intentions on doing that. And in fact, until you see unemployment rise and you see inflation come down significantly, I would not even remotely come close to taking on that thought that the Fed is going to reverse course. You know, you take a look around, I'll leave some more links down in the description. Take a look at chicken and pork facilities shutting down across the nation, right, from a glut of production. Right? That's the bullwhip effect taking place. During the pandemic, there was such a demand for chicken and pork and all the products coming out of the United States that everything started ramping up manufacturing, only to find that by the time it made it to the supply, that the consumer out there, the overwhelming consumer demand, simply was not there. And now you have manufacturing shutting down. That's here in the United States. That same scenario is taking place throughout the entire globe. And here next year, when they're talking about lowering interest rates, we're going to be running into shortages, real shortages. As you right now, there's gluts all over the place, gluts in warehouses, gluts in food production. all these gluts out there that nobody really recognizes. Manufacturing is going to slow down when that inventory from all the gluts has been distributed. The manufacturing base right now is not supplying into it. We're going to come into some real shortages after that. Uneducated economist, you let me know.